Following on from the sillier alternative realities of Night Springs, Alan Wake 2's second expansion, The Lake House, grounds us back in the main story for a tightly paced, atmospheric, self-contained survival horror experience. There's plenty of connective tissue between this expansion and the wider Remedy universe, and additional layers to the narrative themes of the main game, while still delivering its own tale of conspiracy and intrigue. Despite some combat issues, it's great to be back in the world of last year's best game release. As with the base game and Night Springs, the presentation of The Lake House is as good as ever. Janina Gavanka as Agent Kieran Estevez delivers a great performance, conveying equally effectively her competence as an agent, her wry cynicism at some of the more surreal elements, and her shock and terror at the scarier moments. Those scarier moments, especially in terms of jump scares, are used more conservatively than they were in the main game, and for that are more effective. But if you've played the main game, there is a degree to which you're likely desensitized to them anyway. Still, the repressive atmosphere and growing tension as you progress through the floors does make up for that. There's more great musical cues in this expansion, as you would expect, and while keeping in with the level and combat design of Alan Wake 2, the Lake House itself feels like something from Control, as befitting an FBC outpost of course. You even get plenty of random redacting in the documents scattered around. Overall, everything looks, sounds and feels as you would expect a place like this too. And even with Remedy's trademark irreverence, it's perhaps the most oppressive and threatening environment in the game. As a survival horror experience too, it delivers on a lot of the key expectations. The level design necessitates a lot of exploration, including backtracking between floors as you get more access to previously locked areas. There's also the Alan Wake 2 specific flair of the levels themselves shifting, or requiring shifting to allow progression. This ranges from turning lights on or off to open and close areas so you can create access, to moving paint canvases around to make doors accessible, while making the route to it less direct in the process, to areas looping back on themselves before you can progress, or necessitating you travel through a maze in order to open up the ability to walk in a straight line. While doing this, you of course have to deal with enemies. And at its best, the game allows you to choose between standing and fighting to clear a path, or dodging and running to preserve ammo. However, it has to be said that on a first playthrough, there are sections where it feels like fighting is your only option, and at the same time, excessively frustrating. This is because the game will throw a large number of enemies at you in a tight space. On a repeat playthrough to clean up trophies, or after a couple of deaths, you might find a brute force solution to avoiding combat. And it must be said that, to get past light sensitive barriers whilst dodging enemies, flares rarely come into their own here. But while initially trying to fight, the clunkiness of the dodge, the tightness of the corridors, and the way the camera works can work strongly against you. It's very easy to dodge yourself into a corner, get stuck on a random piece of geometry, have the camera spin and disorient you to throw off your aim, or dodge the start of an attack and get hit by the end of it. Or some combination, which ultimately ends in a quick, frustrating death. When the enemies aren't grouped into huge clusters, however, the combat suits the environment, and dodging or downing a couple of enemies whilst navigating a maze feels like it should in a survival horror experience. Even those large combat set pieces, in fairness, can be fun once you get to grips with them, and aren't trying to engage 3 or more enemies in a corridor, but instead luring them into a more manageable space. The only part of the combat that actively feels cheap is when the paint enemies come out of the canvas and grab you, with little to no chance of avoiding with a dodge, and basically zero chance of surviving the QTE unless on completely full health. That's about the extent of my complaints with the game, however, and overall I found my playthrough very enjoyable. It was also a good, solid length for a DLC at around 3 hours. While streaming the game, I did have chatters asking about the length, and while some felt that was good, there were also others who thought it was too short. But speaking personally, whilst I want a substantive amount in any DLC, I'm not in favour of quantity for its own sake. What was delivered was also good quality and felt necessary, rather than merely padded for length. Now, let's talk about the story. As mentioned, you play as Kieran Estevez from the main game, and this expansion is set towards the start of Saga's adventure. You can even access it not just from the main menu, but also by speaking to Estevez before you confront Scratch at the beach and asking what happened at the lake house, which is a cool detail. Whilst investigating the events of Alan Wake 2, Estevez and their team stop at the FBC's lake house facility, only to find it devoid of life and those in charge missing. This is of course connected to the Dark Presence's activity, but also to the experiments being conducted at the lake house itself. And over the course of your playtime, you discover exactly what the local researchers were up to and what it wrought. I won't go into details here and spoil it, but it manages to connect certain events in the first Alan Wake, as well as to the mythos of control in a way that feels organic, relevant to the wider game, and also fairly self-contained as a narrative. Thematically, it also deals in particular with the role of water in the story, as becomes clear as you discover the various pages written by Alan Wake that have emerged in the facility. The researchers' attempts to investigate and replicate the effects of Cauldron Lake upon works of art also at certain point presents interesting questions about what is art and what is merely content, regurgitating a certain form without vision and intent behind it, something that is more and more relevant in the real world, both in the games industry and in the growing use of generative AI. Not to mention, of course, the consequences of scientific research detached from a sense of humanity and morality. There's a lot of details in there for theory crafters and generally for those who like to overthink. Whether at some point I revisit my story analysis of Alan Wake 2 and look at the details we find in the DLC remains to be seen. But it's absolutely the case that the expansions, and especially this one, add more layers to peel back and examine with a fine-tooth comb. And even if you're not doing that, the narrative remains as compelling and enjoyable as ever, with that trademark mix of the dark, sinister, irreverent, and absurd. Overall, despite some issues with certain aspects of the combat, I highly recommend the Lake House as both a survival horror experience and as an expansion of the world of Alan Wake 2. It's also increased my desire to see much more of the Remedy connected universe, including playing through the entries I haven't got around to yet, and impatiently awaiting the arrival of Control 2. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, not just on the Lake House as an expansion, but also any theories about what is coming next and what you're hoping to see. As always with Remedy, there's no shortage of possible talking points. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. Like the video that's just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. This is a Patreon and member supported channel, so if you want to become a member and unlock custom badges and emojis, early access to my videos, and your name in the credits, then click the join button below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.